Good day, everybody. Randy Franklin Smith here, and today we're discussing how to bring Linux into the Active Directory fold. And there's a lot to it, especially if you have more than one distro of Linux at your organization. And I'm betting that's true of most folks, but we're going to find out for sure here in a second. First, though, let me thank Beyond Trust very much for making today's real training for free possible, and I want to introduce Rod Simmons from Beyond Trust. Rod, thanks for being with us here today and sponsoring our training session.
Thanks so much for having me here, Randy.
So Rod is going to briefly show you just a beautiful solution to this whole issue of Linux AD integration, and I can't wait to hear what you folks think about it when you compare it to the state of things that I demonstrate with just a couple different distros of Linux and getting them to work with AD. I'm going to cover at the beginning just a little bit of the architecture of Linux that explains how it's possible, for AD integration to work with Linux, and then we'll talk about how to turn it on, how to get just basic AD login to Linux going, basically, making the Linux box a kind of member of the domain, a member computer of the domain. It will at least have a computer account in the domain, but it's by no means a full-fledged citizen. But once we do that, we will be able to log in to Linux with our AD accounts. Then, at that point, we won't be able to remotely administer it. We'll have to do some things with Secure Shell and with sudo before we look how I misspelled sudo. I do that all the time. Anyway, we'll have to do some things in both sudo and SSH before we really can remotely administer Linux with AD accounts. And of course, that's not the only way that you might use integration between Linux and AD, but it's definitely the most common scenario. Now, the two distros that I'm going to show you how to do this with ended up being CentOS and Ubuntu. And then we're going to talk about how to get beyond just this very simple integration and deal with the larger aspects of that come up in an enterprise. I would like to learn just a little bit about you folks with two quick questions. In fact, I'm going to ask you three things. First of all, at what stage is your company with integration between Linux and AD? Sooner you can punch in your response there, the quicker we'll be able to go. I'm not going to wait for everybody to vote, but generally we get up to about 65–70%. And folks, some of you are answering in the Q&A window, and normally, hey, use the Q&A window for anything, except if we got a poll up, please put your response there. But definitely, we want to hear any and all of your questions, feedback, and hey, you very well may have some good tips for some of the stuff that I'm showing you here today, so please share that. And as always, I'll try to work as much of this in as I can. Okay, I'm going to close this poll. And I'll just tell you quickly, the majority of folks are either not sure or in the info gathering stage. So that's great because that fits where this webinar is. Let me now ask you this. How many different distros of Linux do you have at your organization? Are you completely, Red Hat? Do you have Red Hat and Ubuntu? Let's just see what your answers are there. We're pretty spread out. In fact, for sure, Rod, most folks have more than one distro of Linux. Andrew's mentioning AS400. Okay, Andrew. Do you consider AS400 distro of Linux now, or are you talking about AIX perhaps, other Unix versions? Hey, because that qualifies too. All right. Okay, 70% voted on that one. I'm going to share the results real quick so you can see where your peers are. And I got one more question to answer, or to ask, that is. And that is, like, how many Linux systems? So not flavors, not distros, but just how many Linux virtual machines, servers, and so on do you have? I need to launch that poll, don't I? Sorry. Thanks. All right, so the answers are coming in. So far, a lot of folks are under 100. The poll's up now. You don't have to use the question window. And I'll share this too, because I'm sure you'd like to know where the your peers are. So we're at 70%, closing the poll, sharing the results. Okay, so there you go. All right, now let's move on here with our agenda. So let's start off with the architecture of Linux. So Linux is built with a extensible architecture. The two big pieces that come into play when we're integrating with AD is PAM, that's for authentication, stands for Pluggable Authentication Module. The other part is NSS, and that's especially for just users and groups. So or named objects as it is, and that's the name service switch. Now, by default, when you just install a Linux system out of the box, you're using the default implementation or default plugins for PAM and NSS, which just go to the password and shadow files. That's like local. That's that's very much like a standalone Windows system that has not been joined to a domain. Standalone Linux system. All you have is local user accounts and local groups. Now, what makes integration with AD possible? In all cases, what we're doing is we are using, in almost all cases, certainly all modern integrations, are plugging Kerberos in to PAM. So we've got a Kerberos module for the pluggable authentication module architecture, and NSS is using LDAP, and both of these are talking to Active Directory. So to get information about users and groups, NSS would be going to domain controllers, Kerberos, for the authentication part. And you can see the stuff up here above it, whether you're logging in via Secure Shell or via login right at the console, whether you're running something through sudo or whatever, all of these higher level applications that allow you to log in Linux and Unix are then speaking to PAM and NSS, and it's just so happens that once we've integrated with AD, PAM in turn is using Kerberos for authentication when you give it a domain account, when you try to log in with a domain account, rather than going through the default PAM module to the password and shadow file. Okay, but there's a lot more to it than that when we're talking about Active Directory. Active Directory has multiple domain controllers, multiple domains, and a lot of times multiple forests. And domain controllers can come and go. So how do we find the nearest domain controller? What if that domain controller is down? What about finding the next best available one? That's all stuff that Windows does automatically. And we're going to talk about will Linux do that, and to what degree? And then trust relationships and forests get to be a really big deal. And then one of the difficult things here is the UID and GID problem, and that's a bigger problem for the larger your organization, the more domains and forests you have, and the longer Linux has been around in your organization has a big deal on this too, because that means that you have more existing Linux user accounts out there that need to be mapped up to a single, on many different Linux systems that all have to be mapped up to a single Active Directory identity. And this is where we're bridging two different worlds, or two different dimensions. The Windows AD dimension or plane or universe has user accounts, domain user accounts that are identified by a SID, and we have trust relationships between those different domains and forests. The Linux world, every user account on every Linux system has a UID, and groups have a GID, which is just a relative identifier. So how do we map those? And of course, Bob. If Bob has been around a while, and if Linux systems have been around for a while, then probably Bob is going to have a Bob account on many different Linux systems, probably with a different UID on each one of those systems. How's that going to be mapped up to the Bob domain account in Active Directory? So we'll talk about stuff like that too. The most modern, of course, in Linux, there's always a billion different ways to do something, and the current, most modern, best supported method right now is SSSD, your System Security Services daemon. This is a set of daemons that manage access to remote directories and authentication mechanisms, and it itself is a pluggable, extensible architecture, and its Active Directory module has a degree of Active Directory intelligence built into it. So we're not doing just strictly Kerberos and LDAP. The AD module for SSSD has some awareness, for instance, of being able to go into DNS and find domain controllers, find the current domain controllers, and some implementations of SSD also purport to be able to maneuver your site topology to find the nearest appropriate domain controller that is up, and so on. And so that's what we're going to be using today, both in CentOS and on Ubuntu. What is the alternative, you might ask? Would be to go strictly the Samba route, for instance, with Winbind. That is being deprecated, though, in most distros. So let's start out. How do we do this? How do we take a Linux system that's just been installed? How do we integrate it with AD so we can now log into that Linux system with our AD account and administer it, and even secure shell into it? We're going to start out with CentOS. Then we're going to do the same thing with Ubuntu and compare the differences. All right, so first thing we need to do is just install the extra packages necessary for this. The two biggest ones are realmd and SSSD. There's some other ones that are required as well. And that's just a simple matter of saying yum install realmd and the rest of these packages if it doesn't bring them down by itself. Now, we need some basic network configuration. Of course, we would need to have internet access to begin with, even to get those packages, right? But depending on how you installed CentOS, if you did it with the installation GUI, you may have already configured your IP addresses, subnet, gateway, DNS, and so on. But if not, then your network scripts for your particular NIC would need to be configured something like this. And so what we've got here in the system where we recently did this week is we gave it IP address of 1042.184. Here's our gateway.1, and here are our two DNS servers, which are also our domain controllers. And we told it, hey, the default domain here is lab.local. Okay, so at this point, what do we have? We have a CentOS system, and it's on our network. It can find our DNS servers, which happen to also be our domain controllers. So the next step then is to make sure we've configured our host correctly. And there's two places in Linux where you've got to configure your host. I've done it here in sysconfig network and also in my hosts file. And that's pretty simple. All right, so our Linux system is called Linux TM. Oh, and notice we've added the domain name on there. Now, why is this important? Here's a key point. When we join the domain, this is going to be what determines our computer name over in Active Directory. So now let's join the domain. And we do that by running realm. We're specifying the operation join, and we specified a user account, bvista, and we specified the DNS name of the domain. It asks us for Barry's password, and voila, we are joined to the domain. How do we know it really worked? There's different things you could do, but what Barry did is he just ran the ID command for my account, rsmith@lab.local, and we know that this is a domain account. We know that we're part of the domain because it's successfully completed, and it gives us all the information about rsmith@lab.local, including what groups I belong to. So you can see I belong to enterprise admins and a number of other groups there, and it would only be able to determine that if we're a member of the domain. So can we now log into it? Well, here I've brought up PuTTY, and bam, look at that. I'm immediately able to secure shell into this CentOS system. I found that interesting, by the way. For those of you that have worked with Linux a lot, it may not surprise you, but as soon as the Linux system, well, especially I should say, as soon as a CentOS system joins a domain, be aware, everybody in the domain can now secure shell into this system. Everybody. They don't need any special authority. If you've got a user account in AD, you can now secure shell into that CentOS system. Why? Because secure shell is installed, and by default, secure shell allows anybody to log in. And so as soon as you become a member of the domain, then now you've got all those user accounts from AD available to log in. That doesn't mean that you can administer or change anything. Like if I try to make any changes here, run vi sudo or edit one of the config files in the system, it'll say access denied because I don't have any special authority. Okay, but it's still a pretty big point. And I'll show you here in a second how can we limit the secure shell ability down to just the folks that we want. Okay, so at this point, you can log into the console with any domain account and secure shell 2 if it's installed. With CentOS, it is by default. So let's lock that down a little bit, and let's also enable remote administration for certain AD accounts via SSH and sudo. So what we need to do is add and allow groups line to our secure shell D, our SSHD config file. So there's our file, etc ssh sshd_config. That's what controls the secure shell daemon. And we are going to add an allow groups statement, and the format is the name of the AD group at the DNS name of the domain. So here's an example down here. We created a group specifically for this in our lab domain. So our Active Directory domain is lab.local. So we're saying allow groups domain-ssh-users at lab.local. And so just so you can connect the dots, you see, let's go over here to Active Directory, and I'll show you that group. There you go, domain SSH users, that's my group, and as you can see, there's some members there. Okay, and so that format works on CentOS to tell Secure Shell, hey, this is an AD group. If the user's a member of this group, then go ahead and allow them to log in. don't assume that group nesting will work. That usually doesn't, is the best way I can put it, depending upon your version and implementation of SSSD. So, for instance, we couldn't just take domain admins and put it in the domain SSH users group and then depend on Randy being a member of domain admins, which in turn is a member of domain SSH users. It's only going to look at the immediate user account members of that group. All right, so now at this point, what we've done is we've backed off access to Secure Shell from Active Directory accounts to only those members of this group right here, and that's good. Now, what about sudo? We want these same users from AD to be able to administer this Linux system, and since we're using sudo, then the simplest way to do this, and this is by no means least privilege, okay, but the simplest way to do this that just ties it all to your AD account and prevents you or relieves you from knowing any root password or any other local password on that Linux system is to just take a group from AD and in your sudoers file, give that group the authority to run all as root. And so that's what we're doing right here. This line in our sudoers file, %, if you've watched my other webinars sponsored by Beyond Trust on sudo, you'll know % in the sudoers file means, okay, a group is coming. And here is the way you should format the group, the Active Directory group in a sudoers file on CentOS. And that is name of the group at, again, the domain name. My documentation told me to put it in as caps. I've not tested it in lowercase to tell you if it works that way or not. I do know it works if you put the domain name in as caps. And then, of course, we're saying you can do everything. Now, is this the best way to do sudo and least privilege? No. That's not what I'm trying to illustrate here. I'm just trying to say, all right, now we've got these AD accounts, we've locked down who can secure shell in, but once they secure shell in, we want them to be able to administer stuff. And this is the minimum way that you would do it here in sudoers. So at this point, I should be able to putty in to that Linux box and do some work. Let's see if I can. Logging in as rsmith@lab.local. Let's try to type my password in correctly. And good, we're successful. So can we do something as an admin via sudo? No, access denied. So sudo vi sudo. And of course, this is the first time I've done this. My sudo policy requires me to enter my password. Try that one more time. So, I don't know. I've got the file open somewhere else, apparently, probably here on my console. Yeah, I sure do. Okay, let's try it again. Voila. Okay, so you see, it works. We can remotely administer this box. I'm coming in via PuTTY, right? Secure shell. And we've shown that, well, I didn't show you that it's limited to just members of that group, but if we tried another group, we would not be able to secure shell in, only if we're a member of the domain SSH users group. And also, by virtue of being a member of that group, which is poorly named for its purpose, admittedly, I can also now run admin commands as root. I'm basically root, but thankfully it's going through sudo so we at least have an audit trail of who I am and what I'm doing. Okay, so now just a couple things to think about. Are we really done? Well, here's a couple questions. Do you have a pre-existing environment of legacy accounts that you use for administering and doing other stuff, for that matter, on Linux? Do you have multiple distros of Linux and so on? You've got different versions of them, some with core, some with a GUI. How many different forests do you have? Domains within a forest, that typically works okay with SSSD, but not necessarily multiple forests. Probably you've got legacy users groups on all these different Linux and Unix systems with different UIDs and GIDs, okay? Well, those are all issues that we still have to deal with. But before we dive into those, let's try this with another distro of Linux. This time, let's do the same thing, accomplish the same thing with Ubuntu. We're using 16.04. For whatever reason, we use the desktop version for this, and you'll see that it's basically the same, but it's never perfectly the same from one distro of Linux to the other. And it's amazing how much time can be spent on just those little things that are different. So when we set up this Ubuntu system, we use the GUI to configure our IP addresses, our DNS servers, and our domain name, just like with the last one. So we're starting out with an Ubuntu system that has basic network connectivity to our AD environment. And the first thing that we need to do is install our packages. It's not exactly the same set of packages. Here I'm installing KRB user, Samba, SSSD, and NTP, Network Time Protocol. And let's see here. It asks you by default for your Kerberos 5 realm name, and you should just enter that in as your DNS domains name, your domain's DNS name in all caps. And I tell you, we're not sure why, but when we were doing this, KRB 5 should have done that. It should have prompted us for it, but sometimes when we ran it, it didn't. I don't know what we were doing differently or if it was just the phase of the moon. So in our experience, at least one time when we were doing this, we had to go back and edit the KRB 5 configuration file manually and do that. We had to add in the realm and domain realm information. So there's, sorry, the realm and default realm. So there's default realm, lab.local, and we also had to add in this information about lab.local, specifically one of the domain controllers right there. We also had to set up time synchronization, and you should do this, by the way, on CentOS too. It just so happens that on CentOS, you can still, the AD integration and log on via AD work, even if your time is out of sync. What you'll see is you'll get authentication errors on your domain controller security log, reason 18, hex 18, which is time synchronization, but apparently CentOS SSSD is smart enough or conversely dumb enough to recognize that that kind of pre-authentication failure doesn't mean that the credentials weren't good, but that's not secure. That's not secure, right? Part of what makes Kerberos secure is that things have to be synchronized to guard against brute force replay attacks. So anyway, it works. That's kind of dangerous. I'm sure there's a way to turn it off, but I didn't explore it. Anyway, here in Ubuntu, we are showing we actually configured NTP. And what we're telling our Ubuntu system here is to sync time with our domain controller. Your domain controllers automatically have the network time protocol running on them. And so now your Linux systems, their clocks will match your domain controller time, and then pre-authentication will not fail because of time problems, and the same goes for other service tickets and so on. Let's see here. We also had to do a little bit in our Samba configuration as well, giving it our realm name, a workgroup name, and so on. And then finally, oh yes, our SSD file. We had to add that, and we also put some information in there about our lab.local domain as well. And then finally, since we created this file, we also had to set the owner and the permissions, make sure that those are correct. Otherwise, SSD won't start up correctly. Now, if you're getting a little worried about all the places where you see the domain controller names and domain controller IP addresses, I hear you. This is part of the stuff that SSSD is supposed to handle for you, and it seems to work pretty well. That does seem to work pretty good with CentOS. Our experience has not been the same with Ubuntu, for what it's worth. In fact, oh, by the way, here's where we configure the host names the same way in your host file and in your the other one as well. But one thing, what we're finding with Ubuntu is the official Ubuntu documentation doesn't have you use realm to join the domain, as you'll see a little bit later here when we get to that place. Instead, we use something out of WinBind. It's the net command. And so that's part of the reason why we've had to make these other configuration changes. I don't know why, I didn't see any explanation for why Ubuntu says to use WinBind, even though it's an SSSD implementation instead of Realm, because that's part of what Realm is supposed to do, is configure all this stuff and then maintain it. I'll look here at the comments to see if some of you folks have tips on that. Hey, here's another really sticky wicket that we found on Ubuntu, and that is Ubuntu by default does not like domain names that are .local. So, normally your domain name may be acme.com or lab.com, but you can, of course, create them .local, which is what our lab happens to be, lab.local, and we were punished for that. We finally found somebody's nice write-up that simply says we've got to remove this not found equals return from the hosts element of your name service switch configuration file. And after that, voila, works. Okay, so we reboot our Ubuntu server. Next, we get a Kerberos ticket with the kinit command. So now we are authenticated to Active Directory, and we just, if you want to make sure it worked, you can run sudo klist to see that ticket. And now we're going to join, and you see this is the big one. This is the big thing right here that now makes the Ubuntu system a member of the domain. And instead of using Realm, we followed the Ubuntu official documentation and used net ads join, and then it prompts you for the rest of your information. Once we did that, we started up the SSSD service, and we at this point then, At that point right there, you can now boot up Ubuntu and log on to the console, the character-based console login, the local terminal, with an AD account. A GUI desktop login is not going to work yet, though. There's some additional stuff that you have to do with LightDM or whatever it's called, or of course whatever your desktop environment is. Oh, by the way, Darren mentions he's had issues on Macs with .local domains as well. Okay, and fair enough, Malcolm says Microsoft doesn't recommend using .local. Okay, so let's see here. Okay, so now how do we get SSH working? Well, this is Ubuntu desktop. I think probably because it's desktop, it doesn't have OpenSSH installed by default. So it's very easy to install. It's just run apt-get, and Aptitude will download it and install it. And then we just ran status on it. Yep, it's running for sure. And then we need to go in there, and we added the allow groups, almost exactly like CentOS, but not quite. Notice here on Ubuntu, you don't want to do anything special. Just put in the bare name of the group without the domain name prefix or affix. No, no domain / / no at domain.com or whatever. And that's important. None of the combinations we worked until we finally said, you know what, let's just try it without anything, and voila, it worked. But conversely, that format will not work on CentOS. And then, so now at this point, we can use PuTTY or whatever to secure shell into that Ubuntu system. But in order to have admin authority, of course, we need that AD group added to the sudoers file. And again, it's almost the same as CentOS, but not quite. Again, just put the name of the AD group without any qualifiers. So there you see %domain-ssh-users. That's the name of the group over in lab.local Active Directory. And voila, now we can sudo and do anything we want to as root. So note the differences between CentOS and Ubuntu. With CentOS, we used Realm to join. With Ubuntu, we used net. Notice the difference of the format of group names in sudoers and SSH. Notice that CentOS works even though time synchronization is failing, and therefore Kerberos should fail. Notice all the stuff that we had to hard code in Ubuntu. I'm not saying that there's not a better way to do this in Ubuntu, but if you follow the official Ubuntu documentation, and that's what it says at the top of the screen, official Ubuntu documentation, this is how you do it. Oh, and remember that .local domain fix that we had to do on Ubuntu. So the point is, does your mileage vary from one version, from one distro to another? By all means, and this we're just scratching the surface. Now, you might be wondering, well, how does SSSD do the mapping of Linux UIDs and GIDs to Active Directory? By default, it uses something called optimistic mapping. Notice the UID here is a whole bunch of numbers, but it ends in 1605. So that's my UID for my AD account. Okay, what it's done is it's pulled the relative identifier of my SID. So you're up in the top screen print, you're looking at the SID of my user account in Active Directory users and computers. It ends in 1605. So it adds that SID, that relative identifier to a larger number here to come up with my UID. And what that means is it uses this algorithm then to be able to optimistically map across a way that it has cut up the UID number space. Here's what I'm getting at. So what SSSD does, at least on CentOS, is it takes your UID number space and divides it into a number of ranges, each one of 100,000 possible numbers. Then what it does is it takes your AD domain SID and hashes it, which is an index to one of those 100K ranges. And then, so whatever that range is, in my case here, it was, what is that, billion, like something like 1,782,000. That is the particular 100K range that this lab.local domain SID hashed to. And then within that range, it takes the user's relative identifier, which is unique for a given domain. And so then the idea is different domain SIDs should typically hash to a different hash and therefore index to a different 100K range here within the overall UID number space. And you should be pretty good in a lot of environments, especially a greenfield domain. But what if you already have UIDs and GIDs and existing user accounts, and you want to map existing Linux accounts on different Linux systems and distros up to a single AD account? Okay, that gets more complicated. And that's where this seemingly seamless integration here begins to fall apart. So what I'm finding is, hey, if you've got CentOS and you've got a greenfield, you've got a pretty small environment of one domain, and it's one distro of Linux, and you're not having to map to existing accounts and so on, this works pretty good. You got other versions and other flavors and distros, then your mileage is going to vary more and more and more. And then there's other issues beyond just authentication. What about going from Linux systems to Linux systems using Active Directory? What about accessing web-based applications? What about managing your key tab files, which expire after a while? Also, we've got no group policy support, so that's why we're not a full-fledged citizen of Active Directory. You can't manage, none of this allows you to manage the configuration or policies of your Unix systems. There's no reporting or compliance here that's going to show us how accounts are linked, and support always gets to be a lot of fun. So what the real world is can any given distro of Linux integrate with AD? Sure it can. Any modern distro's got SSSD, and you're going to be able to get it to work. But you see, I've chosen a different line format for each one of these, and that is to point out that we end up using different integration technologies. You saw that between Red Hat or CentOS and Ubuntu, right? We used Realm on one and Net on the other. There's going to be different levels of functionality. You're going to have lots of fun with support, and that's just the way it is. That is the reality of the Linux world when you try to do this stuff yourself with the functionality out of the box. Now, I want to show you an alternative, and that's where Rod comes in from Beyond Trust. Rod, I'm making you the presenter.
Thanks so much, Randy. Hopefully you can hear me okay?
Yep, you sound loud and clear.
Awesome. All right, so what I'll do is I'll start off with a couple slides really quick to get us through, and then I'll jump us over to a quick product demonstration at the end. So PowerBroker Identity Services is actually designed specifically around this use case that Randy has sort of walked you through with other tools, whether you're using SSSD or you're a Mac user and you're using the built-in stuff that Apple gave you. So Identity Services sort of sits in that idea, that single sign-on, that AD bridge that allows you to leverage your AD credentials to authenticate those Unix and Linux systems over onto a Mac, or even Unix, Linux, and Mac systems over to Windows. Apologize about that. So some of the key value adds that we really focus on when customers are asking about this is it's that simplifying or centralizing that authentication. So the challenge that most users are dealing with is that across their various infrastructures, one user might have accounts on 3, 4, 500, 1,000 servers that they're dealing with, and we're able to reduce this down now to 1. So when we disable that Active Directory account, they can't log into AD, they also can't come through. What we mean by single sign-on is that they're able to leverage GSS API to perform a single sign-on. So they log onto their desktop, they open up a PuTTY session, it leverages their Kerberos token, and they're automatically logged in without the need to retype in username and password would be one key example. For the organization, you are now dealing with a single password policy and a single password. So rather than trying to say on server 1 the password policy is X and on server Y the password policy is this, your password policy is AD. And whatever you define in Active Directory, that password policy adheres. So the user can be on a command line in Linux and change their password, and they have to adhere to the global password policy. And as Randy kind of highlighted, that's because you become a full citizen, which means you get group policy pushed down. So it also gives you centralized configuration management from that perspective. And again, like I said, if you disable the account in AD, the user can't log in. So you're able to, when you're leveraging with an IAM system where you're auto-provisioning and deprovisioning users, they only have to talk to AD, and all the other systems are automatically managed because they're using a single credential. And then across all your platforms, you're getting a consistent experience because you don't have to deal with how do I do this for Ubuntu, or how do I do it for a RHEL, how do I do this for SUSE, whatever it might be. You're one product that goes across the entire suite. So no schema changes are required. We leverage attributes from 2703 for storing your UID, GID, Gecko's home directory shell, and your alias is all kind of sort of managed there for you. So all of that stuff is there. You have a command line tool, so if you like to remain at the command line and do everything, you can do it all directly from there. And your ability to join, you could do it at the command line if you want, but again, we have a deployment console that can deploy the software, validate that everything is configured, all those DNS settings that you saw Randy configuring. We tell you what's wrong, what you need to fix, where you need to go to fix it, and then we can deploy the software, join you to the domain, and get everything set up. And how you determine if a user can log on, we absolutely can do it based upon groups, but you also have group policy that gives that allowed logon right, so users can log on to the respective systems. Again, like I said, we support a wide range of platforms and versions within those particular platforms to make your life a little bit easier. And the deployment console is really just there to sort of simplify the management, that you can look at your systems, profile them, validate they're ready to join, and then do joins and upgrade of software from a single management console across distributed heterogeneous kind of deployment architecture you have. So some people said they had 3 or 4 flavors of Unix and Linux out in their environment. This allows you not just across multiple flavors, but also across multiple versions within multiple flavors, which if you've been running Linux for any amount of time, you probably have that pain that you're dealing with some systems that are, I'll say, out of date. So this kind of gives you just a quick shot of the features. I'm not going to read through all these because I talked to them, and I want to just make sure we get a time to jump into a quick demo. Really quick, just to show you the server management console. It doesn't just handle our PowerBroker Identity Services product, but it also handles our PowerBroker Unix Linux product, which essentially is a replacement for sudo that centralizes authorization. But we could talk about that a little more later if anybody wants to hear about it in questions. I can see my various systems. I can see, the flavors of Linux that they're using. More importantly, I can also see the domains that they're joined to. I do have an interface where I can come in. I can look at all of my hosts. I can see whether or not an agent is ready to join or not ready to join. If they're joined, the versions that everything is running on, and I also know the Linux versions they're running, so you can see the Linux versions way over here. But what we're here for is the command line, so let me jump there really quick. Let's go back over there. Sorry. All right, so once I'm on the command line, let's first I'll do a single sign-on because I think that kind of makes sense for everybody. So I kind of alluded, so if I can get here on Windows, and so when I do a who am I command, you can see that I'm demo 1, and now when I jump over to PuTTY on my Linux box, I'll do a single sign-on to one of my boxes, and you'll see I'm demo 1, I'm logged in. If I do a ID, well, I'll do a who am I first. If I could type today. And you'll see that it says I'm demo 1, and I'll run the ID command as well. What you'll quickly see when I run the ID command is you'll pick up on the fact that I'm in the domain users group, which is important. You also saw my message of the day that kicked off that told you I was logging on from the demo.corp domain. You can also see that I'm in a Linux users group and stuff like that. We'll jump into a couple other pieces, but I'm going to take you really quick over to Active Directory use in computers, which is on another box. And you can see that I have a various number of users, and I think this should be my demo 1 user. We'll just go take a look at them. Now, I think when Randy did a log on, he used the user's UPN, like demo1 at demo.corp. And if we go look at the accounts tab on that user, you can see that is my demo 1 user. If we take a look at the groups that I'm a member of, you can see the various groups I'm a member of, like domain users. Some of the groups that I'm a member of happen to have a GID, but there's a special tab in here called PowerBroker cell settings. And over here, you can see what my UID is. You can also see my primary group ID, what happens to be domain users. But if I pop back over, if we just remember 510 and 353 or something like that, let's get this back here, jump away from the member server. There's your 353 for your domain users group. And if you look at my user account, you can see that 510 number. And again, I just try to make it easy because I can only remember 3 digits at a time. Now, as a user, once I'm on a system, I always say an 80 bridge is relatively boring because once you've done like a logged on, it's like, I guess it's over. So just to show you that I actually do have Kerberos tickets, you can now see I did a K-list. And now you can see all my various Kerberos tickets, which DCs I'm buying to, which gives you an idea. For my user, I'm logged on as demo 1. If I just try to do a grep of demo 1 in the Etsy password file, oops, you'll notice that you get nothing returned back because that user isn't in there. Now, if we do the exact same command, but in this case, we actually go look for root. And again, this is just trying to prove to you that I don't have a local user. And of course, my user, 1 second, let's do so I'm doing a PB run so I can elevate and ensure I have the rights to do that. So I'll do a, there we go. And yeah, we'll see. We actually do see the root user actually existing in that file. Sorry, I thought I saw something else popping up there. Now, if we, we'll just do a quick get ent. So we can see that I do have a lot of users that are appearing here, and what you should see, if I can find it really quick for you, I have a lot of users in there, and that was a global search. So even though we searched the Etsy password file and you didn't see a lot of users, all of my domain users, what you should pick up on those, I was looking for my demo user, my eyes just aren't catching it yet, but what you can see is all these users, notice how their home directories are in home demo, which is my domain name, and going on from there. So all of your users are actually kind of just appearing in here now because that's doing a global search, not just searching the Etsy password file, but also searching Active Directory for users that are authorized to perform a logon that have those UIDs and GIDs would be an example of those users. The last thing probably to do, let's just do a, yeah. So I'll jump out of here really quick and make sure I'm back to user 1, which I am, and we'll just do a PBIS, let's get status. Now, what that shows you is the DCs that I'm bound to. So you can see the domain controller that I'm interacting with, the IP address for that, the site name that that DC is in. If I scroll up a little bit more, you can get stuff about policy and all that stuff in here. So what PBIS is really trying to do for you is make it really easy. Now, if I want, rather than doing a single sign-on, let's just let's do one more connection because I think it's worth seeing me typing credentials. And rather than connecting to my server 1, I'll just connect to a totally different box. And I'll type in demo 1. And I type in my AD password. And again, I'm logged on. So I used a single account to get into the box. And again, I went from one Linux box to another Linux box. Again, still using the same AD account, all the same behaviors I'm going to get across boxes. If I disable demo 1's account or any other account that I have on the system and I attempt to log on, the log on will fail. So I can log on with, regular credentials like a normal user would, or I can use the GSS API to give me a single sign-on experience. That kind of gives you a really cool high-level nutshell of what you can get with PowerBroker identity services. So Randy, I'll turn it back over to you.
Yeah, thanks a lot. We've got lots of questions here, some just in general, and if you can help me with some of them that I'm not sure about, that'd be awesome, Rod. But we also have some great questions for PowerBroker too. In fact, let me start with a couple of those. David asks, with domain trust, can we use universal groups or accounts from the trusted domain? or are we stuck with the home domain for account authentication with Beyond Trust?
So when you join a system to the domain, you can leverage the trust relationship across your environment. So you're using accounts in a different domain to log in to the Linux server that's in domain A. I think that's what his question is, that it's part of this, like a Windows system. I can log on to that system provided I have logon rights, and most importantly, provided that that user has UIDs and GIDs and is authorized to log on.
Okay, so you can log on with trusted accounts.
Correct. And you can use domain groups, universal groups, all that stuff he was asking, as long as those groups are given GIDs.
Okay, all right. Does Beyond Trust configuration resolve issues with authentication to local domain controllers and not domain controllers across the WAN? So, you know, the problem of where a system ends up going to some faraway domain controller instead of using an available one locally.
Yeah, so I think probably the question you're asking is it site aware or AD site aware? And the answer to that is yes. As long as obviously the IP addresses that the Linux server that you're dealing with are configured to what site it should be talking to, and the routing is configured properly, then it'll always try to talk to the least expensive DC, just like a Windows desktop.
Rod, how good is the native triple SD, you know, SSSD site awareness? I mean, it has some. I don't, you know, we don't have the resources to set up multiple sites and move multiple distros of Linux in between them. But, you know, what have you heard from customers? Because a lot of people come to you after trying to do stuff themselves, right?
Yeah, I can't say that the site awareness of SSSD has been a key topic that I usually deal with. It's okay. For me, most of the customers I'm dealing with, they need something that's going to work across their heterogeneous environment, and they really like the group policy because they get that centralized configuration management. Those are usually some of the key drivers we deal with for customers who've looked at SSSD and have opted to go a different route.
Okay. Julie would like to know, do you offer a trial installation ability?
Yeah, absolutely. We provide trial installation. We also have, if you just want to kind of play around with identity services, we also have an open source version of it, which is called PowerBroker Identity Services Open, which you can also gain access to get yourself up and running and get yourself started playing around with it.
Hey, now Andrew asked about AS400. Do you have any AS400 support?
No, I think I'll pull that back up. I'm pretty sure that was not on my list of supported platforms. I do apologize. I'm subbing in for one of my product managers, but no, that's typically not one of those things I usually get into.
Yeah, that's okay. Let's see here, man. The questions are flying in. Thomas says, will it work behind an F5 or other application firewall application load balancer?
So, I mean, it's an integral part of AD. So as long as it can talk to a DC, then you're fine. I'm probably not sure what he means by what component he's concerned with working behind the load balancer.
I'm not sure about that either. Maybe you can come back with some more info on that. Satish asked, what about the AWS Linux distro?
I'd have to figure out what it's based on, like what's the core base of the distro you're dealing with. But again, probably just be a matter of trying to deploy our component to it and see if it works. I don't know it off the top of my head, though. I apologize.
It's all right. Let's see here. Oh, Michael asks, I note that an agent has to be installed, thus how process intensive is this product on domain controllers? Now, do you have to install anything on the domain controllers with PowerBroker?
Yeah, so there's kind of setting up the domain, if you will, for that. You're not installing something on every DC. The brained or logic happens in a PAM module, and that's not resource intensive on your Linux servers. The PAM module is kind of doing that redirection so that the authentication is passed over to AD versus the authentication looking at the local etc password file.
Yeah, so we're not installing anything on the domain controllers anyway, and that authentication is basically something pretty, I mean, comparatively lightweight that runs on every Linux system inside of PAM, right?
That's correct.
Okay. Hey, there's a quick poll for you guys while we're answering these. Several people are asking about whether you support multi-factor authentication. Wendy asks, or two-factor authentication. Maurice?
Yeah, we do. It's funny enough, I was going to show that, but I looked at the time and didn't. I was running out. But yeah, we support the kind of basic multi-factor, which I say leveraging Radius. So if you're using Duo or RSA tokens or something like that is supported. We also support smart cards. So if you're you need to make sure your smart card's present when you log on, you can do that kind of stuff as well.
Okay, great. And by the way, we our webinar is advertised for 90 minutes, so we're okay on time. Let's see here. In fact, if you want to show something more later, we can make you the presenter again, Rod. Let's see here. Paul says, so is this a client-based solution, meaning you need a client on the Linux or Unix host?
Yeah, well, there's an agent that gets installed on the Linux host, which kind of brings all the Active Directory goodness to the Linux device. Kind of like when you were watching Randy install SSSD on the Linux device. We're installing the similar type components so that you get the PAM module for doing the authentication, and then the logic that handles group policy reprocessing on an ongoing basis like any other Windows box would.
So Norbert has a very specific use case here. It's definitely a valid one, but maybe it's one you want to take up offline with him. I'll leave it up to you. The question is, what is the best way to join a Linux system in a DMZ and have it authenticate against a read-only domain controller? That's a pretty good one, right?
Yeah, that probably would be a better one for us to take offline, because I would like to pull my services guys in who've probably done that for many customers and ensure we give you the right answer. So if I'm assuming we probably have contact information and we can follow up.
Yeah, we sure do. Yep.
All right.
Okay, next. Sal says user ID and keys login. How's that integrated? Now, I'm not. Are you talking about UID, Sal? We'll come back to you if that's what you're referring to.
My gut tells me that Sal's actually talking about leveraging SSH keys to do authentication. And yeah, you can still use SSH keys to log into the device if you don't want to leverage single sign-on or username password.
Okay. Maurice asked, what is the average setup time? Maurice, are you talking about for like each Linux system, I would think? Come back to us with an answer on that, Maurice. Mark says, how does the product work for cached logins? If the domain controller connectivity from the Unix host is, well, you know what cached logins are.
Yep, fully supported. So one of our typical deployments are on Macs or on Linux workstations. So I think when Randy did one of his setups, he was leveraging Linux desktop. But yes, cached credentials so that you're authenticating against your credentials when you're on a plane flying somewhere and you need to get in with your Windows credentials. Totally supported, just like a Windows desktop.
Yeah, David says, with Microsoft sunsetting Unix services for Windows tools, we are left with hodgepodging tools with PowerShell, et cetera, for configuring Unix attributes in AD. And this is like a big part of what you offer, right? When they have to do single user to bulk user manipulations or mass group imports, et cetera, right? I mean, you're the gold standard with that kind of stuff.
Yeah. So, and you guys might have missed it when I was sharing my screen earlier, and I popped over to show you the UID and GID. I was just in ADUC, or sorry, Active Directory Using Computers, which is typically what a Windows admin is used to being in. And there was just a tab called PowerBroker Cell Settings, and you could see all the information published right there for you. So
here, I'm going to make you the presenter again,
yeah.
Rod.
All right, where's that share button at? Oh, am I sharing right now? Can you see my screen?
I think I have to make you the presenter. Yeah, you are. Yeah, you're sharing. Yeah, we see what you got.
Perfect. So you probably missed earlier, and I do apologize about that. So I'll use the demo one because that was the user we used before, but you'll notice we have this tab right here, and these are just attributes that are stored in AD. If I were to open up something that you're probably more comfortable with, or maybe not, I don't know. Come on, be right there. Hate Windows, that version of Windows. There we go. ADSI edit, there it is. So And only because if you're saying that you need to do bulk manipulation, so you need to do it through scripting. These are just leveraging RFC 2307 attributes. So if that opened up, it did. All right, let's just navigate down through here. I think it was prod. And where's my SE demo? There it is. And we get that same user. Oh, come on. Apologize. This makes for good TV. But when we come in here, and I'm just going to filter only with writable attributes. And let's see if we can just come down and find the UIDs and GIDs. Yeah. So there you can see UID number right there. Remember 510? That's one of the attributes I was talking about. There's your Unix home directory. And that'll mirror exactly what you're seeing over in ADUC. And all the attributes are stored in here. So there's only 5 attributes you're dealing with, and they're all stored in here. There's nothing hidden from you. And that's what makes it very simple for you to do, because you manipulate those attributes and it manipulates it in the back-end system. Now, there's one piece that I didn't talk about. We have every once in a while when you're dealing about doing a complex upgrade for customers who are not greenfield, they need to give a user, I'll call it a slightly different personality. So you'll notice for my default, I always have a UID ending with 510. However, when I log on to this Mac box, I could do something different. So I could say, hey, I want Rod to be able to log into this AIX system. And on that particular system, I could change what the user's UID is, GID is, by adding him into different cells. So in one place, he could be a UID and a GID of one thing, and in the other place, he could be a UID and a GID of something else.
Yeah, and so a cell is a power broker construct for dealing with multiple GIDs mapped to one AD account. Is that a fair enough way to describe it?
Yep, that's exactly a perfect way to describe it.
And it's part of the secret sauce of like you were saying, an enterprise integration of AD and Linux. That is one of the most complex things that you run into. Darren asks, okay, to do what you're showing, do you have to update the Active Directory schema?
No, that's why. So as long as you're running at least server 2003 R2 schema, which by this point I hope you are, that contains the 5 attributes that are required. So just remember, just look up RFC 2307. Because those schema attributes were added a long time ago. We do have a schema-less mode where you don't have to do any schema extensions should you still be running a 2003 R2 schema or pre-2003 R2 schema, but I don't think I've run into a customer doing that for over 10 years.
Okay, so a couple questions here then. Robert says, how does the Power Broker cells work with existing users that already have UIDs? I mean, we've kind of explained that, but maybe it didn't quite connect for Robert. But David also, David gets it. He says, that is so awesome for multiple UIDs, triple exclamation points. He says, what is the max number of UIDs that can be added per user, per account in Windows?
Yeah, so for most customers, they go through a rationalization process. But yes, you could come in, and sorry for this AIX system, I could just come in if I knew this user had a UID of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I just type that in there, and that's what it's going to use. We have a suggest button where we actually go out and generate a UID that's unique, kind of like you were watching with SSSD. But if you're trying to rationalize your UIDs and GIDs, you might want to go and say, Rod had 5 UIDs across 300 systems. We're going to bring them down to 2 or 1. And then for those other ones, we're just going to go out and do essentially permission updating chmod files to update the permission. So it is in part a migration, but if need be, you could have me have on one system one UID set and on another a different UID set, if need be.
David says, is there a bulk tool for importing those rather than typing them by hand?
Oh, yes. Well, remember, you could use LDIF to put the data in because as I probably poorly pointed out earlier, all of that data is natively stored. You don't have to do any special magic to see the attributes that are stored. They're all stamped right on the user object. So if you're using the default cell and you say Rod's primary UID or GID is going to be this, you just you could just write the data like you would any bulk AD operation with a PowerShell script, or writing it with an LDIF tool, or writing it with a VB script if you're still doing those.
You know what we should do next time we do a webinar on this subject is, just dive in deep to like taking a sample imaginary enterprise with a lot of different Linux systems and overlapping UIDs, GIDs, and just show like here is maybe one way we would do this, and if we were using PowerBroker, we'd split these into different cells and so on. I think folks would like that. I'll have to keep that in mind.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Let's see, next up, Brent. Now, Ed is asking, will this work with any standard NAC, NAC? So, it's just not hit. I don't, the NAC I'm thinking of, I don't think it's the one you're thinking of, Ed, so spell that out for me. Robert says, can you all go over the sudo checkout software? The sudo checkout software. Are you talking, Robert, are you talking about the PowerBroker? Must be what it is.
Yeah, so we have an offering specifically focused on sudo. So while we have, for policy management, we have the ability to manage policies with our PowerBroker solution, but we also have the ability to manage all your various policies with our PowerBroker for sudo's solution. So let me just see if I can find my policy. Sorry, they've changed all the configure. There we go. Sorry, scripts. So I can go look at. There's my PB sudo server here. I have my policy files that are all sort of listed here. So I'm not a sudo person by any means, but from a policy editing standpoint, oops, sorry, I clicked on PBUL, PB sudo. There we go. You can go grab your respective sudoers file or your configuration files you're dealing with. For any of those files, you have all your various configurations. And I apologize, in my environment, I always leverage PowerBroker, so I don't have access to a sudoers file. But this will allow you to import your policy file into a database and then have version control management. So probably the best way I'll look at the PowerBroker stuff, and so you can see that. But you can see this has 114 versions of the policy file. So I can come in here, make edits. You have all the syntax. It does inline syntax checking on your policies, and then you can really just check in your policies and save your settings. So
I see. So you're talking about using actual sudo and not the PowerBroker replacement for sudo.
You got it. Yep.
Okay. Cool. Okay, great question for Anthony. Do you need to configure NTP manually on each Linux client, or will PowerBroker's agent handle the time sync for you?
So when you're looking at all your hosts and you want to do a readiness check on any one host, so you choose a host and you want to perform some actions on that host, and you want to perform a readiness check to verify it's ready for you to install PowerBroker Identity Services. There we go. We can just say if we want to install and unjoin. When it does that readiness or that check on that particular host, usually done in the discovery phase, it'll let you know saying, hey, I detected that it doesn't have a DNS name filled in. I detected that it's not pointing to a DC in the domain that you want to join. So it's telling you the things that you need to go fix. Now, sadly, yes, you do need to go touch and fix those items, but it is giving you a list of things that it failed your test on. Okay.
Eric says, is it safe to assume that this product can be used separately from or integrate with your PowerBroker for Unix and Linux and for Windows products?
That is correct. So it doesn't today work with our PowerBroker for Windows product, but that is coming shortly. But yeah, this can be used kind of independent of those solutions. It's designed to manage those solutions, but if you were just a PowerBroker for sudo customer who wanted centralized management of your sudoers files, then you would deploy this particular console and take over management of your sudoers files.
All right. Let's see here. Kaylin asks, what's the rate of losing trust relationship between that computer and the domain controller? You know how that happens with Windows computers sometimes.
I can't say that I see that happening too. It's like I see a lot of, I see many of the trouble tickets that we'll have coming in from customers, and that's not a consistent one that you're becoming disjoined from the domain. So that's not a very common one that I see. But again, from the command line, you can just type in PBIS domain join and domain unjoin and go from there if you ever need to remove or rejoin a domain.
Ed asks, will this provide local machine log on, log off events?
Yes, yeah. So there are audit events that are generated when the user authenticates and logs on or logs off. Yes.
Brent wants to know, how long are cache credentials cached for? Is it indefinitely a specific amount of time?
It's configurable on how long your cache credentials live. I don't remember what the default is off the top of my head.
Now, Paul has a great question. It says, will cache credentials now, with that now support on Linux clients, does that mean that they'll be vulnerable to pass the hash attacks? You know, that's not exactly the question, because cache credentials, at least in Linux, I don't know, did I say Linux? At least in Windows, it's not the actual hash that is cached. It's a hash of the hash for what it's worth, although they have come up with attack vectors for cache credentials. But that's just for Windows. I don't know how it's been implemented in Linux. Yeah,
it's implemented. It is implemented similar, and I think the pass the hash attack is not something you need to worry about with cache credentials. But we will follow up with you in an email just to make sure that I did give you the right answer. Okay.
Stephen asked, does this product support output to a SIM product?
Yes. Yeah. So if you want to send the data over like Splunk or
ArcSight or Syslog,
Elk, whatever it might be, yes, you can get the data over there.
Okay. Okay, so Chris asks, can the Ubuntu process be scripted at all to be more automated, or does it require manual configure each time? Yeah, I mean, certainly those are all just config files that you could script the changes to, and I would really like to, I can't imagine there's not a better way to do what I demonstrated on Ubuntu than what we got to work using the Ubuntu official documentation. But maybe it is, because Ubuntu is not targeted the way CentOS is or Red Hat is at the enterprise. Faraz says, our Winbind and Samba service keeps breaking constantly. Would PowerBroker help with that?
So I know that we do have Samba integration. I guess I'd probably have to understand a little bit more of what's breaking and what the pain is. But yeah, you're connecting to shares and stuff like that, and you need to connect to Samba shares. We do integrate with Samba, but I'd have to understand a little more of the pain.
Satish is wondering if there's, if you could share anything from the Beyond Trust roadmap on supporting authentication and password management for containers, you know, like Docker and so on.
It is something that we have on our roadmap. For the password management, obviously that would be tied into our password safe product. For the credential management, stuff like that. We do support containers in certain ways today, but yes, we do have a very strong offering in the container space that's on the short-term horizon.
David says, we have Samba issues when we upgrade OS versions of the domain controller, especially going from 2008 R2 to 2016. Interesting. He's saying, but that probably means we need to move to Samba 4.x.
That's exactly what I was thinking.
Okay. Let's see here. Man, this has just been a great webinar with lots of awesome questions. Can you touch on... Bear with me, folks. Oh, how's that licensed, Malcolm asks. I don't think I asked that one of you yet.
Yeah, you know, that is the one question that I never answer because I'm not sales. So if I remember correctly, it's licensed by, I believe it's licensed on the system level versus the user level, but I can get 100% insurance on that so that you have a proper answer. Okay.
We've just got lots of other people saying, you know, they have a big concern with keeping authentication local and not having Linux systems go out over the WAN to authenticate. Keith said, what about when the UID is different on each Linux system? But I think we've covered that, Keith. By now, that was a while back that you asked that. Let's see here. Stephen had asked, what are the steps outlined for you when you started the integration for whichever version? So, hey, Stephen, I should have included the links to the articles that we began with for the process that we came up, that we demonstrated both for CentOS and Ubuntu, but I'll remedy that by including that in the follow-up email. Brendan, remind me to give you a couple links, please, on that. Let's see here. Hey, a lot of people were asking me, was I logging in, like when I put in rsmith@lab.local, was that my UPN or was that just the account name at the DNS domain name? Now, normally they're the same, right, Rod? But you're probably familiar with how in AD you can add additional DNS names and give users different UPNs. Is that, and I don't know if and how that's supported with SSSD like I was demonstrating. I didn't create an account and give that account a different UPN and then try to log on with it. But in terms of Beyond Trust, I would imagine that you support different UPNs.
Absolutely. Yep. If and I just want to make sure that I'm answering the question right, so I'm going to come in and look at a user object just so we're all on the same page. I believe the question is, if the UPN and my domain name is demo.corp, but if the UPN was, let's say, demo@butter, like that, and I attempt to authenticate in, will it work? And the answer is yes. That is a valid UPN. So I can log in with domain/user, or demo, sorry, /user, demo1@butter.com or demo1@demo.corp. And as long as it's a valid username for that user, they will be authenticated in.
Brian asked, does PowerBroker have a way to limit who can secure shell into a server based on group membership the way I demonstrated with SSSD?
Yeah, I apologize. I didn't answer that one clearly, Brian. So we leverage group policy for choosing, like kind of like you do in Windows, where you can push a group policy down and say allow log on, like allowing a user to log on local, and you push those settings. We have a group policy setting just like that for your Linux devices to authorize them to log on to the systems.
Great.
Or restrict as well.
Awesome. By the way, Benjamin has a really great but highly specific question you might want to take a look at when I send you the spreadsheet. It has to do with remote read-only domain controllers and so on. Let's see here. Faraz says, in regards to our Winbind and Samba issue, what is happening to them is users keep losing authentication in Windows Active Directory and require us to restart all of the relevant services. I guess on the Linux system, Faraz?
Yeah, I've never seen that with using PowerBroker Identity Services. So I do believe we'd probably provide some assistance there, and probably should be something we should follow up with after the call.
Well, and that's the thing. You get what you pay for, right? I mean, if you guys are committed to making AD integration work, and that mileage is going to vary, a lot based upon different Linux distros and the community. And I mean, shoot, the community folks help out a lot, but so many times the responses you see is, well, why are you even doing it that way? Use this instead, and so on. You know what I'm saying? Yep. It's just the way it is, I guess. Okay. Well, I think that we are at the end of our questions, and pretty much at the end of our time, too. This has been great. I can tell just by the amount of engagement from the audience. Very nice job, Rod, and thanks for helping me answer these questions, and just thanks to you and the other folks at Beyond Trust for making today's real training for free possible.
No problem at all. It was our pleasure.
All right, folks, have a great day, and we'll be in touch again soon. Bye-bye.